Good afternoon and good morning. My name is Jeff Tucker. I'm CEO of Tucker Company. We're going to allow just a few moments here as folks filter in at 12 o'clock Eastern. Just very briefly, this is our first in a series of marketplace updates that we plan for approximately monthly. And this session will be recorded, and each attendee will get a recording at the end of the session. These sessions are timed to be 15 minutes. I'm going to do my very best to be done in 15 minutes. I will stick around for another 15 minutes after that, or longer if there are questions. I'm going to get right to it in the interest of time. So this is a trucking marketplace update. And we've had a heck of a time. Anyone who's managing freight today has had a heck of a time and unprecedented time. About 2 months ago, headlines of the Wall Street Journal read, "Everywhere you look, the global supply chain is a mess." And then a whole bunch of things happened since then. But that little picture in the right-hand corner, bottom right-hand corner, is a picture of Ford F-150s in the parking lot beside the factory, awaiting for semiconductors. Apparently, the number of F-150s can be seen from space. If you think your supply chain is challenged, just imagine that scenario. But just a week later, not even 5 days later, after that Wall Street Journal article, this happened. Snarling global commerce for days. If that wasn't enough, these are some other major impacts that have contributed to the worst capacity crisis, the worst clogging, gunking up, I'd say, of the global supply chain. I'll start with back in March, and we're going to show you a little data, but back in March of last year, through about June or so, we lost about 20% of the nation's for-hire drivers. That's 600,000 drivers, roughly. It was a punishing time for drivers. But by February of this year, that entire hole had been filled, and then some. In fact, February, we reached the largest number of drivers in history. And I haven't gotten March and April numbers, but I'm anticipating them any second, but I'm anticipating those numbers to be increased. Driver numbers lag just a little bit. So you might be asking yourself, where are the drivers? Well, they're out there, I promise. We'll get to that. But then obviously early February, Texas was the victim of those storms and lost their power. Refineries were down. It was a bit of a mess for citizens there, but also for the supply chain. I put the railroad merger in there on March 20th. It's not affecting today, but it's a major, significant event in the future for rail shippers, and one that will probably lead to reduced competition as previous large rail mergers have. More to come, obviously, in the future. But then the Colonial Pipeline went down May 7th, snarling dramatically, especially the East Coast, but especially even more so the Southeast, where created quite a bit of problems for fuel and fueling and refueling, and of course sucked a lot of drivers out of the driver pool who were qualified to handle bulk. But I want to focus on these last two because they're really impactful. The LA Long Beach, the Port of LA and Long Beach, are our nation's largest, or really the entire continent's largest port. About a few days ago, 20 container ships with thousands of containers on them each. 20 container ships were moored outside that port waiting to get in while other ships were being unloaded. A year ago, there was one. So what happens? Train speed's slow. Last bullet. Union Pacific reported this week, train speeds were down 12%. What's happening there? it's very impactful. It means a lot for trucking. Trucking is very delicately balanced. Everything in the supply chain is very delicately balanced today, but trucking in particular, the subject of today. So every minute that one of those moored ships sits out there in the Pacific waiting to get brought into port creates urgency. Those containers are typically loaded onto either locally or they're loaded onto rail for intermodal or further inland or across the country. The urgency grows with each minute, as I said, and what happens is shippers who own that cargo want to expedite the freight, right? So they're substituting truck for rail. That sucks all kinds of capacity out of an already all-time stressed marketplace. And you've got people literally in the octagon duking it out and trying to find those trucks. And what we're seeing in the spot market is driving truck rates up 2 and 3 times what we expect to pay because, oh, by the way, it's growing season in Southern California. So, I mean, everything that could possibly go wrong within the supply chain from an orchestration standpoint is going wrong. Last week was DOT inspection week. And just data that I just received today showed that there were 17% fewer trucks posted in the spot market as a result. That's about twice of what is normal. Huge, huge, huge problems. I'm going to just touch base on this chart. It's complicated. There are 4 years of data. And every shipper, well, most large shippers have TMS, a transportation management system, or a load tendering. So you give the load to the primary carrier, and then there's a secondary third. In a marketplace like this, typically there is no second or third, or at least on paper there is, but in reality, every carrier everywhere is booked, overbooked, right? So basically, if that number one carrier and that carrier in that number one position isn't available, and there's exceptions to every rule, but generally speaking, there ain't no alternative than to enter the spot market. But let's just read this. This is a outbound tender rejection index. It measures the percentage of shipments that the primary carrier rejects. I'm going to go through this 4 years of data. I'm going to start with the oldest, the purple line. Purple line is 2018. At that time, the all-time greatest capacity crisis any of us have ever managed through. And you can see, and that really started in 2017. 2018 was a rough year all the way through. Got a little easier, but you can see roughly in the beginning of the first half of that year, about 25% of shipments were being rejected, meaning 25% of shipments were somehow entering a spot market. And what do we see? August, it got under 20% and began to moderate. All the way back to the left-hand side again, we look at 2019 in the orange, and it picks up right where it left off, but it really settles down into a nice dull roar. And anyone managing freight in 2019 remembers that was an easy year. Everything was in equilibrium, things just worked, and it was kind of fun and nice. And then all of a sudden, scroll back to the beginning of this chart again, and we'll take a look at 2020, the green line. 2020, I remember being interviewed by Journal of Commerce about, well, it's really slow. Starting out slow. This was in January. Starting out slow, slower than last year. We could feel it. We could sense it. We didn't know what was ahead. We heard early inklings of COVID over in China. Then you see, COVID and that ridiculous spike. And then end of March, April was our toilet paper runs and our water and PPE and everything else that had to get through that supply chain for our 2-week shutdown. And then, so we went from the second highest tender rejection, and in truckload demand, it was the highest truckload demand, to the lowest truckload demand ever on record inside of a month. And here in this data, load rejection to the lowest on record, tender rejection. That's when, to the previous slide, that's when we lost all those drivers. There were trucks parked in front of the White House, or well, close as they could to the White House, beeping their horns and protesting. It wasn't enough freight to move. Fast forward, that green line, you look in July, July took off like a rocket, and we have not looked back since. So we've been in this capacity crisis for 10 months. And now we'll go all the way back, and well, just for a moment, we hit almost 30% of loads being rejected by the primary carrier. All the way back to the left, and you see the blue shaded area and the blue shaded line. So a couple or few weeks in the beginning of this year, we were a little lower in terms of tender rejections in 2018, but we spent the last 2.5 months well in excess of tender rejections in 2018, just charting a new course. Everyone managing freight, you're managing freight in an environment that has never been this challenging in history. Spot market. So spot market loads, load posts for dry vans, flats, reefers, etc. 36% higher than this time in 2018. Not 38% higher than last month, but 38% higher than the worst capacity crisis in history. 7 times higher than this time last year. So, what's, when you're dealing with trucking, when you're trying to manage through this, you've got to understand that trucking environment, the trucking industry is extremely small. Carriers and drivers talk. There are Facebook pages dedicated to complaining and praising and everything else. And it's a real tight-knit community. And what I've asked our team, our capacity leadership team, to do is to share, what's happening in the spot market. What are you hearing in the spot market? And I'd like to bring some stories to you from our capacity leaders, actual stories that have just occurred to us during the last week or so. Sounds of the spot market. We'll plan on sharing this kind of information in an ongoing basis as time goes on. But due to the Colonial Pipeline issue of last week, we had one carrier told us, I'm searching for fuel. This is my 7th place. Another carrier in North Carolina reported that he was paying $10 a gallon. We saw news reports indicating similar, but he could only fill up a certain amount because they limited the amount of fuel per individual. So hopefully folks got out of those areas, and it was a struggle last week. Oh, last week that DOT inspection, that always every year creates havoc. It's the week that drivers take on vacation, but this kind of thing happened to those who didn't take vacation. There's a Chicago IMC that we work with that said we're not taking any more new customers, and we're not taking any more new lanes and or new business awards from existing customers. That's how packed the railroads are. Growing season, I mentioned already, in California, growing season is having an impact. It's happening in Florida. As growing season occurs throughout the rest of the country, this will only exacerbate what we are living and managing through today. Folks, this is a really big one. Our team is constantly, when we have afternoon deliveries, constantly bending over backwards to try to find anyone, any driver, anywhere who's willing to do an afternoon delivery. The trucking industry for 100 years has lived on early morning deliveries so they could pick up in the afternoon. If you're operating that way, really important to think about how can I change? How can I be more flexible? We had a driver, this is a crazy one, a driver last week tried to reject a load that we tendered to him only because just before he got there, he Googled the location and found some pretty negative reviews in terms of how long it takes to load a truck. So folks, this is a really important thing that, again, social media, someone's got to be monitoring this. And if you see, feedback that your location or a location is providing lots of delays, that negatively impacts your ability to find trucks. Really important. Now, in this case, we were able to say, look, we pick up there all the time. We know everyone there. We were able to kind of talk them off the ledge and get them to pick it up, but challenging. $250, again, $250 layover fee. Typically in the marketplace, that's kind of normal, but we're throwing, in some cases, $1,000, $1,500 at these kinds of opportunities, and drivers just have so many opportunities. They're not willing today in the spot market to lay over. Reefer rates I mentioned. Reefer's really high. We just heard statistics yesterday that showed reefer rates have reached an all-time high. Strap yourself in. The average reefer rate is over $3 a mile nationally. And I remember being blown away when it was 2 a few years ago. That's the average. So, reefer carriers are in high demand. They're also not as willing to make drop-offs, stop-off. You can't pay them enough to make that because, well, they're burning fuels at both ends, right? They're burning fuel in the reefer unit. They're burning fuel in the tractor. And lastly, we heard that some drivers moved over temporarily, at least, to move bulk to help out with that pipeline issue. So those are some of the sounds from spot market, and just kind of in summary, we're just over that 15 minutes. I apologize for that. I will do better, I promise. But these are some of the things you got to be thinking about. You absolutely have to be thinking about. And Noel Perry, a famous economist in transportation, was on a panel last week. He said, look, folks, shippers, you've got to be thinking about once every 4 quarters, you're going to deal with some catastrophe. We have been talking about the first 33 years of deregulation, there was 1 capacity crisis. The last 6 years, 3. Every 2 years, we have a capacity crisis that lasts 6 months to a year and a half. So you cannot be just a friendly shipper, a friendly shipping location once in a while. We're at a point now where you've got to take all these things and do as much as you can for as long as you can and make it part of your culture. So lead time, flexibility, those morning deliveries I pounded on a little bit ago, quick loading and unloading, and avoiding the multi-stops to the extent that you can. Look, can you adopt all 5 of these and then some? Maybe not. Can you adopt 2 that you're not currently adopting? Maybe so. Folks, 15 minutes is up. A couple minutes may be over. I will stick around for questions and look forward to your feedback. We're going to send a survey out asking for topics. Sometimes it'll be me speaking for these marketplace updates. Maybe it'll be someone from our team, or maybe it'll be an industry expert friend of ours. Thank you for your attendance, and open to any questions there may be.